Hey, welcome to Doctor's Homestead. My name's Daniel, and I want to talk about solar power. So, like solar basics, basics for off-gridders, preppers, homesteaders, and just get into some of the components of a solar power system, whether you build it yourself or you have someone else do it. Kind of talk about some of the options you might be looking at and just kind of understand each component and what it does. And it all starts with solar panels, right? The solar panels are what bring the power into your solar system, whether you have a whole house system or you've got a little Jackery or even a little solar phone charger. It all starts with the panels. So panels come in a lot of different sizes. These are 100-watt panels, so I have 4 100-watt panels. They're 12-volt panels. Bigger panels might be 300 watts. Smaller panels might be 1 watt, 10 watts, 5 watts. Really depends on the size of the panel. So even though they're 100-watt panels, doesn't necessarily mean they're producing 100 watts all the time, right? That has to do with how much sunlight they're getting, which depends on the sun, obviously, and then the angle. So these are about 28 degrees, which for where I live, that's ideal. You can look it up online. There's some websites that help you determine what the right angle is for your panels, depending on where you're geographically located. I know the sun isn't always in the same place all year round, so it depends on time of day, season, that kind of thing. But we'll call them 100-watt panels. That's what they call them. They produce up to 100 watts. Generally, when your panels are producing electricity, they count about 4 hours of usable electricity per day. It doesn't mean they won't produce longer, but in terms of max power, the average they figure is 4 hours of good sunlight. And once again, depends on where you're at, time of year, the weather, cloud coverage, all that kind of stuff. But these 100-watt panels could produce, we'll call it 400 watts a day, times the 4 panels gets you up to about 1600 watts. There's another 4 panels on the other side of the roof to catch the sun when it's over on that side of the sky. It just happens to be where I'm at. So we said 4, 8, 1600 times 2. If I do the math real quick, that's about 3200 watts that I could get in a day out of this system, right? And that's at 12 volts. They're configured in 12 volts. So if you want to figure your amps, you would do watts divided by volts. If you want to figure your watts, do amps times volts, and we'll get into that a little bit. But since these are 12-volt panels, think about Christmas lights. I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole here, but if you think about Christmas lights, you could plug 4 strands of Christmas lights into a power strip and you have 4 individual strands, right? If those were all solar panels, you have 4 strands coming in, that's your 12 volts. If I plug 2 of the panels together, wired them together, right, and then wired 2 together, if I had 2 strands of 2 panels, could actually run at 24 volts, right? And that's considered series, and then series parallel if you have multiple series together. If I had all 4 of them wired in series, that would be 48 volts. Now, technically, they don't produce more electricity, more watts, but by changing the configuration, changing the voltage, that affects the amps, right? And we'll get into amps a little bit on the equipment, but the higher the amps are, the more heavy-duty wires you need. So if you think about voltage, a volt, an electron as a car, right? The volts is how fast the car is traveling down the road. The amps really is, you could say, the number of cars, the size of the roads, right? The watt is the overall total of all the electricity going out. You could say electrical consumption is watts. And there's ohms. We're not going to get into ohms at all. Ohms is resistance, right? The more connectors and the longer the wires and all that stuff, you get into resistance. We're not hitting resistance too much at all, but just be aware that you need your panels, right? If you want to produce solar power, you need your panels. You need enough panels to produce the power you need, we'll say in 24 hours if you're off grid, in the 4 hours, right, of the day you're getting good sunlight. So you need really 6 times more electrical production on your panels than you need for consumption for a day. So it's something to keep in mind, something to think about. Higher volts means less amps. Less amps means smaller wires. Also means you can probably get more panels with the same equipment, assuming the equipment can support the voltage. So when you're looking at like a whole house system, you're probably talking about a 48-volt system, right? They're not going to do a whole house on a 12-volt. 12-volt systems are likely going to be smaller because the amps are higher. So I think that's everything I wanted to hit on the panels. We're going to go over to the box and look at some of the other components. You've seen this before. I've done a couple different videos. The idea of this video, as I said, was really to talk about each of the individual components, what they do, and what you might need depending on your situation. So the way we're wired is the solar panels are on the roof, and the wires come into the box and they go into the charge controller. So the charge controller takes the electricity from the panels and feeds it into the batteries, and it'll actually convert the electricity as it needs to provide an optimal charge to the batteries without overcharging them. So there may be times when I've got too much electricity coming off of the panels, then it would be safe to dump into the batteries, and actually dials it back a little bit. So the charge controller takes that electricity and says, okay, we're going to feed into the batteries, right? And those, you could say, is sort of an independent system. Electricity comes from the panels, goes to the charge controller, goes to the batteries. Now, if you're a grid tied system, you might not have batteries, which means you probably don't have a charge controller. You probably have a grid tie inverter, right? So the electricity is probably going from the panels to sometime a grid tie inverter, and that's feeding back into the power grid, which is great if you want to lower your electric bill, right? Because you're pushing power into the grid, and that's probably spinning your meter back, and depending on where you live, you might get some money back on that. You might save some money. You might not. There's no guarantee on a grid tie system whether you save money. I actually have friends that really haven't. They're like, hey, you know, this is really expensive. I'm paying the bill on my solar, and I'm not. My electric bill didn't go down enough, right? And once again, a lot of factors, right? A lot of factors on setting up like a whole house solar, especially if it's grid tie, especially if you're trying to save money. You might not. Depends like how much sunlight, where the panels are. There's a huge bit going into it. This is what we call an off-grid system, right? It's kind of a complete self-contained system. It is grounded to the ground, but other than that, it's self-contained, right? So we got the power coming in. Once again, 4 12-volt 100-watt panels. They produce, let me get my calculator out so I'm not just making numbers up. You know, math on the fly is always a little challenging. So we said 12 volts, we said 100 watts. So we can actually take the 100 watts divided by 12 and say they're producing about 8.3 amps, so times 4. So we get about 33 amps of power coming in. And once we said, really the amps is the amount, the volume of electricity that affects the wires. The wires need to be big enough to handle the amps. The breakers need to be big enough to handle the amps, right? So these breakers are here. If it produced more electricity, if there was some kind of weird short or surge, the breaker would pop, protect my charge controller. The charge controller is a 40 amp charge controller. I'm saying I'm producing about 33 amps of power. So technically maybe I could squeeze another panel up there if I wanted to. But as I was talking about on voltage, right, the default is 12 volts. This brand, this particular charge controller can run at 12 volt or 24 volt. My inverter could only run at 12 volts, so I've got a 12 volt system. I'm pretty much set on 12 volt here unless I want to replace some components. But when we're talking about 24 volt versus 12 volt, and why you might, if you're going to build a bigger system, if you're just starting out, you kind of need to know how big you're going to go or why before you start picking your voltage. The default's probably going to be 12 volt if you're building it yourself, simply because the sourcing of the materials, right? If you go to places like Hardware Freight, Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, gas stations, most of that stuff you're going to find retail is 12 volt. Right now, maybe in your area, your store's got other equipment, but most of the stuff off the shelf at the gas station is 12 volt because cars are 12 volt, RVs are 12 volt. It's a very common voltage for systems to run at. My system's 12 volt. The advantage of 12 volt as, say, a prepper is if the inverter goes out, I can go down to the store. I can go to the gas station, get another inverter, swap it out. If you want a bigger system, if you want a whole house system, if you want a lot of panels, you're probably talking 48 volt. That equipment's a little harder to get. It's a little harder to find. You're probably going to have to order it, right? Which in most times is okay. If you're worried about SHTF or something like that, you're probably going to have a hard time getting components to maintain your system long term, right? So you got to look at what you're doing, why you're doing it. Once again, if I switch to 24 volt, I could have twice as many panels, right? I have 2 charge controllers, each with 4 panels. I could probably go 5 each. If I was 24 volt, I could have 10 panels, right? Produce twice as much electricity, and because I increase the voltage, the amps goes down, so I wouldn't have to worry about the wires, right? If you have too much amps on your wires and the wires aren't sized properly, it'll melt the wires. So something to keep in mind, right? You need to do that math, figure out up front, hey, we're doing 12 volt. You keep the voltage consistent. I don't want 24 volts coming in and then 12 volts going out. Keep it consistent, keep your configuration consistent. But by having 4 batteries, I could wire them as 12 volt, I could wire them, which would be parallel. You could do series parallel, wired as 24 volts, or go straight series, wired as 48 volts. So there's some flexibility here, but because of the equipment, I'm stuck on 12 volts, and I'm okay with that, right? So if I wanted to go bigger, I could increase the voltage on it. So we talked about the charge controller that takes the power from the solar panels, adjusts it so it charges the batteries without damaging them. Got the inverter. This is what supplies power to the house. So I have an outlet going into the kitchen, and I also have outlets going, or electrical, not outlets, electrical going to the chicken coop. So all the stuff in the chicken coop, fans, lights, everything like that's running on the battery bank. You can see I'm 100% right now. We got good sunlight, 800 amp hours. So it's not really putting a drain on the system, but by going off grid with the chicken coop, it saves me a couple bucks a month or something like that would cost to run the batteries, or sorry, run the lights, run the fans. So a couple bucks, maybe it never pays for the equipment, but it saves me some money, right? So rather than going, you know, a whole house over to solar, or going, you know, grid tie or anything like that, this is an independent system, so I can plug things into it that want to run on the solar, ultimately saving me money on the electric bill, and have it as backup power. Right, we said 2,000 watt inverter, that's the power coming out, so that's how much power I can provide out of these batteries, the 12 volt 200 amp hour batteries. So let's say exactly how much power do I have here, right? So this is amps, right? This is watts, 2,000 watts. We know the voltage, so how do we figure that out? So together, 200 times 4, we could do that. That's 800 amp hours, right? They're lead acid batteries, so you don't want to go below 50%. So I could say 400 amp hours times the 12 volts. It's 4,800 watts, right? You could say 4,800 watts for an hour, right? 4,800 watt hours. So I could provide 4,800 watts of power before the battery's at 50%. Forgetting that, hey, the sun's trying to charge them as we go, right? That's the goal, is the sun's coming in, power's coming in, power's going out. But at any given moment, I've got 4,800 watt hours, 4,800 watts for an hour, you know, 2,400 watts for 2 hours. You can kind of do that math, and you gotta do that if you're sizing your system. So if I look, coffee machine could be, say, 600 watts if you were running consistently, or 600 watts for 2 cups of coffee. So if I got 4,800 watts, 600 watts, that'd put me about 4,200 watts, maybe if I ran the coffee machine for an hour non-stop. And we've done some tests, like I hooked up the refrigerator to the outlet inside, didn't draw a lot of power, and there are actual voltmeters you can get to plug into the appliances to see exactly how much power you're drawing. And once again, if you're going to build your own solar system, if you're going to pay someone to build a solar system, you kind of need to know how big, right? How big do you want to build it? What do you want to be able to run, and work it backwards from there? My idea here, this is backup power for my house. So this said primary power for the chicken coop. I've got outlets all over, so I could run tools and whatnot off here, but it's really an independent little backup power system for me. So we talked about list of components. There's some other components in here. We said charge controller, we said battery, we said inverter, but there's some other stuff in here on the wall. They're little doodads and widgets. A lot of these are breakers here. These are big old breakers. So, you know, electricity can surge, right? So if you have a mismatch, if you have a surge, if some equipment fails, if you get a short, the breakers will pop, hopefully, and protect the other pieces of equipment. So it keeps it from overpowering. These are bus bars. You got a hot bus bar, cold. These are my 12 volt bus bars, and basically a bus bar just lets you plug a bunch of things together, right, without having to have everything tied into the same bolt. So it just helps keep everything a lot cleaner. This side's my 120 volt bus bar. You got hot and cold there. Have an optional power switch for the battery. That right there actually connects to my battery meter, right? So I have my fire alarm, smoke alarm right up there, a couple Bluetooth modules for the charge controllers, switch for the inverter. So there's a lot of components in here, right? Breakers for the panels. One thing I would recommend if you're building your own solar setup is up here on the wall. Maybe you can see it. Actually wrote a manual, what each thing is, what it does. Got instructions here: power it off, turn off the inverter, panels, battery, power on, battery, panels, inverter. Just some kind of quick, easy guides I've got actually written. That's the battery switch, those are the panels, that's the inverter switch. So if someone comes up, they don't know your system, they actually have a pretty good idea. Hey, how do I at least operate this a little bit, right? So we talked a little bit about voltage, system size, expansion, watt hours. We hit on that, list of components. And once again, so this is a standalone system. You know, if you think about, hey, I got a Jackery, I got a Bluetti, I've got solar generator. Really, it's this in a small box, right? And since their equipment isn't magical, it's smaller bits of equipment, right? So, you know, you're going to pay more, and I've said that many times, if you do something like a Jackery or one of those, than if you just bought the components individually. Whether you've got an inverter, you've got your batteries, right? Now, these are lead acid batteries, and I know a lot of people like the lithium batteries. I've got nothing against the lithium batteries from what I'm building. I like the lead acid batteries. I'm not worried about weight because I'm not trying to carry this around. It's probably 500-600 pounds worth of batteries sitting here. I think the lead acid batteries are simpler, they've been around longer, it's basic technology, less likely for like an EMP or some CME or something like that. You're not going to kill an old lead acid battery. They have better surge capabilities, I would say, than most lithium batteries at the price. Very simple technology, but if you like lithium, go with lithium, right? You do what works for you. I think that's about everything, as I said. So this is my backup power system. It's wired back to the house. You know, they've got an outlet inside. We've used that before. We might show you again. That's hardwired into the inverter. Lets us use electrical systems, right? Little electrical appliances and whatnot. You know, we had a power outage. We were able to just plug in right there and use that right away. You can use it to charge batteries. Ideally run some freezers, run a fridge, something like that in a long-term grid down. But it's good to have. It's useful to have your own solar backup system with enough batteries to run what you need to run, a big enough inverter. Once again, so the inverter size, this is 2,000 watts, means I can produce 2,000 watts out at one time. The inverter does use electricity being turned on, so you don't want a bigger inverter necessarily than what you need. I don't know if we talk too much about the inverter. So you kind of need to know ahead of time what you want to plug in, what the power requirements are. Said work it backwards from that.Maybe you need a 5,000 watt inverter, maybe you only need a 500 watt inverter, right? That's the power you're producing. Once again, the batteries tell you how long you can run your electricity for. Amp hours really is your stored power. How long can you run your appliances? How big are the appliances? And then how fast can you charge your batteries? So that's your basic components. So that's it. Appreciate you for watching. I hope this was helpful, and thank you.